One of the first things that I did was go to sign up for the first Moms for Liberty Summit in Tampa in June 2022. And I signed up using my name, but I did wear a red blazer with an American flag pinched into the lapel.
Yep.
And it was interesting when I checked into the hotel. The woman at the desk immediately said, "Oh, I'm with you guys. I'm upgrading you all to a high floor." And so suddenly I'm way up high with a water view just because I was perceived as being with the Moms for Liberty team.
Yeah.
And at the same time, it was right next to the Tampa Convention Center where MetroCon was being held. And MetroCon was billed as Florida's largest anime gathering. So you're out on the streets right outside of the Moms for Liberty and even in the lobby, and there are people with horns and spandex and glitter and colonial garb. And I was thinking to myself, what a beautiful clash of cultures.
Yep.
I'm in the elevator wearing my lanyard and all my stuff, and I go up and three kind of MetroCon goers step at the elevator, and I could just see them looking at me like, "Oh my God!"
You're like, "I'm a reporter. I'm a reporter."
But it was really interesting because you could just feel a certain vibe.
This is the Culture Study Podcast, and I'm Anne Helen Peterson.
And I'm Laura Papano. I am author of School Moms, Parent Activism, Partisan Politics, and the Battle for Public Education. And I've been an education journalist for over 30 years.
Wow. Just pronouncing parent activism, partisan politics, and the battle for public education, that's a real feat.
Well, I mean, with the title like School Moms, you kind of have to explain what you're talking about because so many moms are involved in schools on both sides of the issue these days.
So your book came out January 30th, and I would love to hear, because especially given your history and what you've been writing about for decades, who is Moms for Liberty, why you came to focus on them, the process of writing the book.
So I didn't only focus on Moms for Liberty, but certainly that was some of the early reporting that I did.
Yeah.
And as I say at the beginning of the book, I didn't plan to write this. I didn't want to write this book, but I felt compelled to write this book because what I saw happening around the country, much of it led by Moms for Liberty, was really not about education. Public schools have for years and years and years been the place where people came together in common cause. Yeah. As a mom, as a PTO mom in schools, just a regular mom of kids in school, I never knew what people's politics were. That wasn't the point of schools. Schools were a community where we all came together. We, did whatever tasks we did, bringing in tissues and markers and baking things for the teacher appreciation breakfast or whatever it was we were doing it not for some goal, but other than to support our school community. And what I saw happening was that the far right, and Moms for Liberty in particular, saw this as a political opportunity and decided to insert into what was a nonpartisan space a very partisan goal, which was to use schools as a vehicle for gaining political power.
So a lot of our listenership is very familiar with Moms for Liberty because they have kids in school and have encountered their presence in various school board races and school board meetings, all sorts of things. But if you are not in that orbit, I think that you might have heard of them, you might understand them as part of this larger constellation of organizations that is involved in the quote-unquote culture wars, but you might not know exactly who they are. I was explaining to my mom yesterday, who used to be a school board member, and I was like, Mom, a lot of these people are homeschoolers. They don't even have kids in the school. And she's like, why do they care? And I'm like, well, that's a good question. But so I would love for our listeners who are maybe a little bit less familiar, if you could give us just a quick little overview of who Moms for Liberty are, where they get their money. I know that's a complicated question, but
That is a very complicated question. So, Moms for Liberty, started in 2021 after Tina Deskovich lost her school board race in Brevard County to Jennifer Jenkins. And, a lot of the issue in that race was around masking, which kind of, as we all saw at that time, the kind of masking, no masking rules were what really set off a lot of the protests at school boards. And interestingly, what happened at those school board meetings was that people found each other.
Yeah.
And that was a way, it ended up being kind of an organizer to gather people. But Moms for Liberty started, there are three co-founders, Tina, Tiffany Justice, and Bridget Ziegler. So Tiffany and Tina have been like the most visible leaders. And it really was just, it's a far right white Christian nationalist message of fear. Your children are at risk. This is dangerous. We have to counter what's happening in the public schools. A lot of it anti-teaching about race, anti-gender, anti-LGBTQ, claiming that the libraries collect pornography, which they do not. Just a lot of things really to whip up the fear. Mm-hmm. And what's interesting is that was precise. It's as if the Moms for Liberty were the answer to a problem that a lot of far-right organizations had been looking for. Meaning, if you look at when a lot of these groups like the Leadership Institute, the Heritage Foundation, a lot of these far-right, very well-funded groups started in the 1970s, and they had been, somewhat successful. But when moms suddenly arrived with the very message that kind of mobilized, you saw it on TV at school board meeting. They mobilized people in ways that these far-right groups had been unable to do. And so it was a very natural alliance. What I noticed was interesting is at the first Moms for Liberty Summit in June 2022, their main sponsor was the Leadership Institute, which, has been training conservatives for, since the late 1970s. And there were only a few tables. I mean, you could walk out of the ballroom and there was 6, 7, just a handful of tables. When I went to the Moms for Liberty Summit in Philly this past July, their main sponsor was Patriot Mobile Action. And we can talk about Patriot Mobile in a minute, but there were corridors and corridors and corridors of far-right groups with tables set up to, attract, cater, involve the moms. Yep. At that first conference, I remember having a conversation with the leader of the Noah Webster Institute, which is, one of these conservative groups that had just decided to offer school board training online, and he was so excited that he had a couple of hundred people sign up. So it's as if all of these organizations, in that same summer, the Leadership Institute started online school board training. It's as if school boards had for a long time by the far right just been overlooked as trivial offices because they, it was education, it was women, it was moms, and moms have been very invisible in terms of power. But these far-right organizations, in essence, saw just a wonderful natural constituency. At that first summit, Ron DeSantis stood up and announced that he had endorsed, for the first time ever, school board candidates. And he had everyone who was running stand up. Now, the women who were standing up and the women all around were just so impressed that someone, the governor of Florida, Ron DeSantis, would deign to endorse school board candidates. What he was doing, I realized as I was sitting there, was basically feeding a ground game. So it wasn't as if he was doing them a big favor, as they felt. They were doing him a big favor. Yeah. And that's really how this system has played out.
So I grew up in Idaho, and I did a lot of reporting there over the last 5, 6, 7 years. And I'm very familiar with how the far right works there and the entire movement for, or like part of the mechanism, the recruiting mechanism for people to move to Idaho to be part of, whether it's the American Redoubt, which is not really a place, but like sort of a place in North Idaho, Eastern Washington, Western Montana. But like part of it is we have educational freedom here, right? So a lot of these ideas are very familiar to me, and I've seen them in action for a long time, and watching as essentially other organizations figure out, oh, like here's how we can infiltrate every single corner of the legal system, the educational system, the ideological playing ground, basically, in a place. Like that's what's happened already in North Idaho, and now they're trying to duplicate that playbook in other places. Mm-hmm. Okay, we got some really great questions from our listeners, and we're going to start with the how and the why of Moms for Liberty. This first question comes from Hannah, and Melody's going to read it.
I'm wondering about why I'm seeing so much of their organizing at the school board level, like targeting school board policies, speaking at meetings, or running for school boards. Why this institution particularly? Are school boards uniquely susceptible to this kind of right-wing takeover?
So I think like even the idea that school board members are elected, like that is really interesting to me. And that you do not have to be a parent of a student or even participate in the public school system, besides obviously paying your taxes, in order to take this role. So what do you think it is about the way that we have organized school boards that make it susceptible to this sort of ideological takeover?
Firstly, school boards have been much overlooked for a very long time. As someone who's covered education for decades and decades, until I was working on this book and watched hours and hours and hours of school board meetings, Oof. I had not really attended many school board meetings. I was a school board rep in high school, and as I admitted in the book, would often fall asleep after, sports practice and homework and everything, to the drone of adult voices like debating, school bus routes. The issue is that school boards actually are very flexible in what they have as far as control.
Yeah.
Very wide. Someone, that I interviewed in the book is a longtime trustee in Upper Dublin School District in Pennsylvania. And he said, we take a very hands-off approach. We don't control curriculum. We hire people and we let the professionals run it. But that has certainly not been the case. And we have so many examples now of where you get a far-right school board and the school board is suddenly meddling in issues from curriculum to bathroom use to what teachers can hang on their doors or their walls. So school boards are a very kind of malleable way to gain power, to gain cultural and social power in a district. What's interesting is that because they are often overlooked races, voter turnout in some of the races that I followed were as low as 10%. Yeah, so it doesn't, there are people who are losing by a few votes. In North Idaho, I did a story for Hechinger Report and Vanity Fair recently. And, one race that turned a school board to the far right was lost by 8 votes. Yep. And the person who lost said, everyone just assumed I was going to win. So what you have happen is you have school boards having, this power over the functioning of and rules of schools. And I'll give you an example of in Keller, Texas, the school board was flipped to far right. They suddenly changed the whole way that books were purchased for libraries. And then instead of librarians who are exquisitely trained to curate collections that suit their communities, suddenly the school board set up new rules, with a whole matrix of what could and couldn't appear in books. And a process by which books needed a 30-day review of the public, and then each book purchase had to be approved by the school board. So I watched one of these 5.5-hour long meetings where a middle school librarian in the district came up to the mic and basically said, we cannot obtain in a timely manner books on camels or squirrels or football. We cannot get the latest Guinness Book of World Records or the Diary of a Wimpy Kid. And she said, kids who read a lot are coming up to me and saying, where are all the new books? And she said, I don't tell them the truth, which is that it's political. There's an example of how you flip a school board and suddenly kids can't get books about camels and squirrels and football in a timely manner. So there are real consequences to this.
And there's a financial aspect to all of this too, right?
Yes. So one of the reasons why these school boards can be flipped is because it used to be that people would run for school board, maybe spend a couple $100, maybe $1,000, Xerox things, and their friends would help them. What you had happen in Texas is that Patriot Mobile, for those who don't know, and I did not before I started doing this research, is a Christian cell phone company in Texas. And they donate 5% of their profits to far-right causes. And they list them right on their website. And in January 2022, they started a political action committee, a super PAC called Patriot Mobile Action. There were 11 school board races in 4 districts in North Texas that spring of 2022, that they poured in over $400,000 to those races. Because they were a super PAC, they couldn't donate directly to the candidates, but then through different local PACs that were education PACs that were set up to support the far-right candidates. And I, looked at all, I was looking at a lot of campaign finance reports and looking at where the spending was happening. And a lot of spending was happening on behalf of these candidates at Axiom Strategies, which is a national political strategy group based in Kansas City, Missouri, and happens to also do a lot of work for Ted Cruz, Ron DeSantis, for national political candidates. So what you have then is you have national level strategists and marketing people producing materials for local school board races. Patriot Mobile supported those 11 candidates through their super PAC. They claimed credit for it. And they won all those races. And they flipped for those school boards to far-right school boards.
And we'll get to this later, I think. But at least the goal in Idaho, some people say it's just making the schools so bad. That's part of the point.
Oh.
They don't want public schools.
Yes, exactly.
They want to dismantle the public school system and turn it into a voucher system for privatized schools or for, a place where you can homeschool and have complete control over everything that your student consumes. But okay, we'll table that for now because we have a great history question that's next. This is from John.
It seems like groups such as Moms for Liberty pop up every 10 to 20 years or so. Book banning and conservative attacks on public schools and curriculum are nothing new. I'm thinking especially about Alice Moore in the 1970s in West Virginia. That's before I was born, but there's been a lot of great reporting on this lately. What is different, new, or novel about Moms for Liberty compared to past groups? And how is the current environment impacting their tactics versus these past groups?
I love this question because there is such a history of wielding moms as this apolitical, it's just moms looking out for their kids, nothing nefarious going on here. So I'm wondering if you can just root us a little bit historically here and talk about what's different.
So I was referring to Kanawha County in West Virginia. And I included this in the book because it actually fed into the Pico versus the Island Trees School District in Long Island, which was kind of one of the key school censorship cases. But the West Virginia case, when I dug into it, what I did is I looked at newspaper archives and stories of the time. And what was so interesting about that was to discover that the Heritage Foundation was on the ground down there, and that the one of their expert speakers that was there to kind of get everybody all lathered up and angry about the textbooks in schools was from upstate New York and was leading anti-sex education and anti-busing efforts up there in the 1970s. And, what Alice Moore did was really just a version of what we are seeing now, which was, object to certain materials that were part of the curriculum and present them in such a kind of frightening light that people were very upset. And there was one pastor down there who wanted people to boycott the schools and said it'd be better to not go to school at all than to go to these schools. Unfortunately, what happened in Kanawha County is it got very violent. There were 2 people who were killed. There were bombs. It was just a really, really distressing situation. But in a reminder of what we see now, based on emotion, people get very, very riled up about their children, especially if they believe that there are dangers. And some of the dangers are of what they're exposed to. And I think there were textbook crusaders who were opposing readings that involved, kind of Janis Joplin and Bob Dylan, these kind of, we should be talking about our heroes from the revolutionary period, not these kind of modern rascals. So which is kind of what we hear now.
It's just, they weren't using the term woke. They just were like, they call them hippies. And I love the idea of object. I feel like parents now would also object to Bob Dylan in the schools or Janis Joplin in the schools in some capacity, like if you were studying those lyrics or thinking about it. But also the point that you made about how the person who came down to West Virginia, how that person had been involved in anti-sex ed stuff, but also anti-busing, which I think is an important through line, right? This isn't just about...
Yeah, it's also about segregation. Yeah.
Yes, it's also about preserving whiteness.
Yes.
And that's always, like you said at the beginning, and this is something that I've talked about with lots of other authors, about white Christian nationalism. This is not just about Christian values, it's about white nationalist Christian values.
And one of the things I've been asked, why do you use the term far right in your book? And I say precisely because we're talking about extremism. The nature of public schools is that they gather everyone, and that means gathering people from a wide spectrum of views. But extremism is different. Extremism is about destroying public schools. It's not about being part of the conversation. And to your point about what's different now, I would say speed and money. The kind of rapidity of messaging, video, things that can be shared, clipped, moved, changed, recast, to be, endlessly persuasive.
Right.
Creates a very dangerous situation in which people believe things that are not true. In the Pico Island Tree School Board censorship issue, when they were pulling books from the library and banning them, and the school board just insisted upon it, they removed 11 books. And one of them was Slaughterhouse-Five by Kurt Vonnegut. And their strategy, similar to the strategy we see now at school boards, is people would read objectionable sections of the book aloud. And I remember one of the objections to Slaughterhouse-Five was that Jesus was called a bum. and the member said, I don't care if the rest of the story is good. That's enough for me to exclude it. So that seems kind of very mild to us now, but maybe in another couple decades this will seem pretty mild. But yes, this stuff comes around and around again because people find that schools and curriculum and books are a way of imposing values and political will. I think the Moms for Liberty in particular got a head start. The pandemic gave people a head start on that.
Right. So our next question takes us back to something that we've discussed a little bit already, and it's all about parental rights. This is from Bethany.
I live in Ohio, and I've heard the phrase parental rights come up often in the recent passing of legislation against transgender youth receiving gender-affirming care, sometimes in conjunction with Moms of Liberty. How did parental rights become such a rallying point for conservatives? What do they really mean by this idea? It seems like a thinly veiled attempt at control tactics to me.
Yeah, so this is about parental rights for people who want only a specific types of parental rights, right? Like not for parents who want, affirming healthcare for their trans kids or parents who want their kids to have sex education. So those people don't have parental rights. It's only the people who want a different sort of parental rights. So is this the first time that this phrase has been used? Like who came up with it? Where did you first encounter it? Let's talk more.
Well, I first encountered it as a journalist back in the 90s in Newton, Massachusetts, when there was a plan for a sex ed pilot. And you have to understand that this was, after AIDS. AIDS
Right.
really changed how schools thought of their job relative to sex education, and that it was
Right.
important to have conversations that they hadn't had before for student safety. And so there was this pilot that was planned. But then there was a small but very vocal resistance that I ended up writing about. And they claimed not to be involved with the Christian Coalition, but I found a lot of connections between this, local group. And ironically enough, the leader of that local group in Waltham, Mass. Now leads a national anti-LGBTQ group. But it was at those school board meetings, and they were packed. There were cameras to overflow and people standing in the parking lot just to kind of hear this. And that I heard that phrase come up. These are our parental rights. We have the right to not have homosexuality mentioned or, sex education. Now, parents have always been allowed to opt their kids out of things
Right.
and decide that, they didn't want that for their child. What's frustrating and sticky about parental rights is that it's really in imposing your set of what you think parental rights mean on everyone else. It's meant to look at like we're just protecting our own children, but it's actually quite the opposite. It's like, let us dictate for everyone's children what should be the standard. And what was interesting, going back to Idaho for a second, is when I was there, actually on election day this past fall, I met with a father of 8 who had 6 children in the public schools. And he was conservative. He, his Facebook page, as he pointed out, has the American flag and the Second Amendment. And yet he said this kind of presumption of, that our kids are being indoctrinated, that is, he said, paranoid bull honky, which I loved.
Very Idaho.
Very Idaho. And he said, I have my children, and he said, if I cannot, as a parent, challenge something they might have heard or be involved or know what they're thinking or learning in school, then I'm not doing my job. He said, of course they're going to hear things that I disagree with. That's the nature of the world. But it's my job as a parent to really counter that and to discuss that with them. And I thought, what a refreshing way of thinking about it, because it's absolutely 100% right. The parental rights sounds like it's this, big endowment of, parenting roles, where it's a really very reductive act of let me try to impose my set of parent rights, my view of parenting. And we know if you get 20 parents in a room, everybody does it a little bit differently. Can you have a sleepover? Can you not have a sleepover? Do you have to finish your dinner? Can you leave the table? Do you have to eat as a family? I mean, there are so many things that we have different rules about. The idea that we should be able to impose a set of universal parental rights on schools is absurd.
So I will say that the one thing that I think a lot of more progressive people might struggle to understand is that I listen to this conversation and I'm like, absolutely. Parenting, this is the way that we equip our kids with the tools to be discerning, and no book can change a kid single-handedly, right? They can introduce them to ideas, but then they have to figure out if they like those ideas, what they believe about those ideas, right? Like, it's a very sophisticated understanding of child agency as well. And what I think sometimes that we miss is that a lot of people who believe otherwise, they really do think that this book is the work of the devil, and the devil is a sneaky asshole. So he uses a book and can be so powerful through that book to infect a kid, right? And that, to me, from my vantage point, I'm like, that's ridiculous, right? But if you have been surrounded by that belief your entire life that like the devil is so powerful and will undo our most ardent work, then that at least helps me understand how what I understand is irrational, why they believe it. Does that make sense?
Well, yeah, but also, and I think also one of the things that we're skipping over here is the idea that, I read Genderqueer, and I thought it was the first time that I ever kind of understood that, non-binary, what that felt like, the confusion, the frustration. Do I think second graders should read? No, but the author said, I imagine this for high school and older. And what we're forgetting is that the job of librarians is about curating and selecting and choosing and placing. And we are taking that away from them. And they're doing that job all of the time. No, not every book is perfect for every child at every age. And, and it's not even an age thing. Some kids are more mature than other kids. That's why we need professionals. And what this whole crusade is doing is undercutting the professionalism of librarians and teachers and people who work with children every single day. And not just your child, but lots of different children.
That's such a good point. And we have a lot of librarians and educators in our listener audience. So I know that they will appreciate that as well. So our next question is about the who and also the how. And this is from Laura.
I'm a late Gen X, and I know you're an elder millennial. These women are our contemporaries. What in the world happened? Banning books in the age of the internet? Such deep homophobia? Relatedly, can you pull the threads on some of the astroturfing origins of this group?
So we've talked a little bit about the astroturfing. So I think we can direct this person back to that section. But the profile of the typical Moms for Liberty person, like, is it a upper middle class suburban woman? Is it more like the people that I knew growing up in Idaho who are very much involved in like the more white nationalist parts of this? Like, is it that there's a certain leaders and then people kind of get grouped into it because they agree with the phrase, like, it's gotten too woke in schools? Like, what's going on? What the fuck is going on?
Well, I can tell you that my first reaction at the first Moms for Liberty conference was that, geez, I should have brought my high heels because it was a very kind of well-coiffed and like, Southern audience. And it was a lot of people from Florida. The one in Philly was a little different. Who are these people? A lot of them are suburban for sure. Yeah. But there are a lot of also Moms for Liberty adjacent groups that draw in people of all ages. Fear speaks to people at all ages. There is this prototype of the Moms for Liberty for sure. It is very white, but it's not only white. You get there are a whole range of people. Right. I don't think it's just one single demographic.
So Laura's question was about why there's this sort of regression, and like this is not new, right? Like the 1960s were, maybe you understand that as a time of like cultural rebellion. I personally understand it as like the birth of the modern conservative movement, right? Like, like there's all these things there's always this counterweight that's happening, particularly in America.
I mean, people are angry. There's a lot of unhappiness right now, and it's like, who can capture that unhappiness best and fastest and most consistently and over. And I think what you see is that the messaging is not very deep. It's just really hitting particular emotional tones. And, millennials, Gen Xers, moms are busy people. Parents are busy people. There's a lot being asked of them, and there's a lot of uncertainty. And if you can kind of rally all your uncertainty around the one problem of protecting your children against, evil threats that may not be real, but there's a whole team there that will support you in doing that. I mean, it's not that different than, team sports. It's not that different than the NFL. I mean, it's about teams. And I think that that's one of the real important tasks for people who care about public education is, okay, let's break this down. Because I am, as a journalist who's covered education for decades and decades, I'm not going to say that there aren't problems. I mean, my main job as a journalist was to look at the problems, look at what people were doing and ask hard questions. Does that really work? Is that making a difference? And that's not the conversation that we're having right now. We need to get back, and because there are legitimate, real problems, and we're not going to solve them if we're just fighting over, what books we have in the library.
Okay, so our next question is all about pushing back against this sort of activism. We got a lot of questions about this because I think people are genuinely, they're curious about what Moms for Liberty is and why it works the way that it does, but they also want to fight them in their communities. So this question is from Caitlin.
What is Moms for Liberty doing that Moms Demand Action isn't? And what can other groups learn from the, quote, success of Moms for Liberty? Like, truly, how are we having serious conversations and seeing actual policy change about young adult novels, but not automatic weapons?
All right, so Moms Demand Action was founded in 2012. Also has significant financial backing from Bloomberg.
I get emails from them every day.
And it's specifically about gun policy. So
right.
Are these similar groups? Is it fair to compare them? Like, how do we think about it? And then the other thing that I feel like we have to mention is that, like, in the 2023 election cycle, so many Moms for Liberty candidates lost. They might be successful in bringing these issues to the forefront, but I also think that they are not as successful as their public profile might suggest.
I think both of those things are true. In terms of the pushback, Caitlin, great question. I think that, Moms for Liberty has been successful, and I think there are some people who align with them who are not officially Moms for Liberty. Mm-hmm. Moms for Liberty has effectively defined a kind of language for talking about things that scare people. So they have a very effective kind of playbook that way. But people are fighting back and actually very effectively. And I think we saw some of that in November. Red, Wine, and Blue is one organization that was started by Katie Paris. She was a DC political operative involved and moved to Ohio and said she imagined herself living in a kind of interesting purple state. And when she saw, kind of things happening there, realized that she wanted to do something about it and went around and was having conversations with women. She said often over a glass of wine. So it's called Red, Wine, and Blue. Not that you have to have wine, but it's fine. But the point of it was that it was social and to engage people, not just like sign them up to do tasks, but to create a community around pushing back and organizing. And if you look at that strategy, that approach is actually what you see in a lot of places. You have Stop Moms for Liberty, so that started in Brevard County by Liz Mkhitaryan. And what was interesting is that I was talking with her recently, and she said, when Moms for Liberty first started in Brevard County, she said, we just didn't even take it seriously because their claims were so absurd. And she was a 24 or 26-year veteran teacher. And she said, we were in the schools. We knew that their claims were not accurate. We didn't think they would catch on. Now they have 46 chapters around the country. So, and there are a lot of local groups that are pushing back in their communities. And I think of in Bucks County, Pennsylvania, as one great example. That was where you had a far-right school board, but then you had a mom, you had Kate Nazemi, and a retired English teacher, and they started Advocates for Inclusive Education. And that brought in teachers, parents, community members, and has just done the hard work of detailing every, a policy comes up. What does it mean? What are the implications? What are the results of this policy? Educating people, bringing people together. And I actually talked with Kate last week, and I said, everyone's been really cheering the results in Pennsylvania and the Moms for Liberty just being kind of turned back. And I said, are you guys done? She goes, oh, no, not at all. She said, we already know that they are plotting to retake this in the next round. So she said, we have to be really vigilant. I'm on their email list. Got an email today about a turnout for, there are 3 meetings. Try to attend one of these. It was like school board and finance and another committee meeting. Just really keeping people informed, but also building a sense of community around schools. And she said, we do these community events. We have ice cream socials. And she said, we started doing something that was really effective. She said, candle making. She said, broad swath of people from around their district would come and do candle making. She said, when people are doing crafts, they kind of settle in and start talking. And she said, we have hard discussions, but there's a kind of feeling that we're all doing this together. And I actually think what a brilliant way of rebuilding some of what is getting lost in the kind of NFL style our team fighting that's going on. So building community. We don't all have to agree on everything, but we have to agree that our children matter, that they deserve an excellent public education, and that involves professionals. It doesn't involve parents with an agenda meddling in whatever a teacher says, whatever books, whatever's on the it should not involve that level of parental oversight.
I also think about the comparison between moms going up against the gun lobby, which is so entrenched in so many ways. And, at the very top, right? Like all the way at presidential candidates, all the way down, versus a group of people going up against a librarian who can be more readily delegitimized, even though they have so much training. Like they know how to do their job. But one thing that we often do with feminized professions like librarians is say like, oh, it's a job that anyone could do, right? Like all you have to do is love books, which is a ridiculous thing to say or to understand about the work that librarians do. But it's easy to say like, oh, well, as we talked about earlier, here we can come up with better standards on how we can get books into the school. To think that like the incredible hubris of that, to think that you could do that yourself. And I think that is part of why there has been more success, quote unquote success, for groups on the far right, like Moms for Liberty, than Moms Demand Action.
Well, also gun laws are like the third rail of American politics, right?
Yes.
I mean, and the truth is that a gun in rural Idaho for hunting is different than a gun in New York City, and how people feel about them and the role they play in their lives. Yeah. You're right about the hubris. People think they can do that. And as part of doing this research, I actually interviewed quite a number of librarians, and there were some I said, just walk me through what's required. Walk me through the process of how you choose. And you realize it is extremely complicated.
Yeah.
Every school library is different from every other school library. And the books must be, practice is that you curate the books that reflect your community and you weed books. I never knew about weeding books, that if books, you don't want books to be in libraries that are so old as to have inaccurate information or to be out of date. So if students are using them for reports or tests or research, they're not useful. So there's a lot of attention that needs to be paid. And librarians take these jobs extremely seriously. And they apply a lot of expertise. I mean, to be a librarian, you need advanced degrees in which you have studied library sciences. There's a lot to learn.
Yeah. This is great setup for our last question, which is from a librarian. And this is from Brooke.
I work as a public librarian, and fighting this group on a national level is important, but even more important is effectively working against them locally. What are the best ways to combat this insanity at a local level, especially when local politicians are happy to do the work for them?
So I loved our discussion about like creating community around public schools and in places where people can have these conversations that are a little bit less fraught than the meetings themselves. But what are the other strategies, particularly for people like librarians, people who are closer to the public school system and doing that work?
Well, back to Bucks County, when I was doing some reporting there, I was there on Banned Books Week, and there was a part of the event that I went to one evening was one in which people showed up and wrote postcards of encouragement to librarians, just to let them know that they were, that you're taking a lot of harassment publicly, but that you also have a lot of support.
Yep.
That strategy of constantly letting people know that you have their back, that you are supporting what they're doing, that, that you're recognizing the expertise and the skill that they're bringing. And I think that going forward is more of a conversation that we need to be having on the local level, is instead of just complaining about this, what you see so often is people take a broad national kind of set of grievances and just use them on the local level. But I think on the local level, we need to be talking about what our librarians are actually doing, what are our teachers actually doing, what is happening in the schools, what are the projects kids are working on, what are the ideas they're sharing? Because there's a lot of great stuff that happens in schools. There are a lot of wonderful moments. I mean, I run the school newspaper in New Haven, Connecticut, and for kids in grades 3 through 8, oh my gosh, they are so smart. They have such interesting insights about the world, and let's celebrate that. Let's celebrate. And I don't mean celebrate in some trivial way. I mean, let's talk about it. Let's remind people of the details of what is actually happening and being accomplished. Because I think we've given up that territory too quickly and put ourselves on the defensive.
Part of it is the vacuum, right? Like when you don't know what is going on in the schools, you can map any sort of things onto it. And you're like, oh my gosh, they're talking about George Floyd. What they're making everyone feel bad about being white, or they're making the white kids feel bad about being white, or whatever. They can imagine their worst understanding, the worst faith understanding of what a teacher is doing. And personally, and I imagine you probably feel the same, like I think the lack of like a robust press is part of this problem. I remember growing up, the newspaper was at our school or at a school all the time, just taking pictures of kids, like doing kids stuff at the school. And then you also have all of the attention that's paid to sports in various capacities. But I think that it helped fill in that imagination of like, what are kids doing at our schools with visuals and then also with little stories. And now, if Facebook's the only thing that's filling that thing, and it's all these negative understandings of what your kids are doing, or like your friend of a friend saying, like, I've heard this. My a grandparent's friend said that all the kids in the schools now are trans. That's sort of just like fear mongering. There's nothing to be afraid of if a kid is trans. Clearly, no, like we can agree on that. But that idea that somehow the schools are turning kids trans, which is not how it works. Anyway.
Well, it's interesting that you bring that up because in 2021, the Heritage Foundation was concerned about this, and they commissioned a nationally representative survey of political opinions of K-12 teachers. And not surprisingly, they found that teachers tended to be more liberal, not kind of way left. But what they did discover and what they found and announced in their reporting was that didn't necessarily impact children. And this is a quote from the report. It says, "We find little evidence that a large percentage of teachers are systemically imposing a radical political agenda in K-12 classrooms." That's the Heritage Foundation.
Can you say who the Heritage Foundation is? Just for
the Heritage Foundation is one of the far-right organizations founded in the 70s, who is actually there on the ground in Kanawha, West Virginia, but has been a big far-right supporter. So what's interesting is that just a few years ago, they were perfectly willing to say that teachers might be more left-leaning than the population, but the teachers view their jobs as being teachers. They're trying to teach them math. They're trying to teach them reading. They're really not ideologically imposing their views on students. And we have to remember that, because what we hear now is something different. And we're hearing something different, not because anything's changed, but because it's politically expedient to claim that that's what's happening.
This has been such a great conversation. It's pissed me off. It's made me hopeful. That's kind of how I feel about the far right whenever I talk about them. At least in terms of the hope comes from like what we can do and how we can move forward. If people want to find more of you, where can they look?
Well, laurapapano.com. I have all my articles they don't go back 30 years because the internet didn't happen then. But yes, there's a lot of stories. There's other things. There are links to events and podcasts. We'll put this up there.
Yeah.
And, I'm also I'm on Twitter, and I have a Facebook page, and I did start an Instagram at the urging of my children. So as I go around, do these conversations in different places, I'm going to put a little bit up there.
Awesome. Thank you again so much. This has been a really great conversation.
Thank you.
Okay, for our Ask Anne Anything segment, we are answering a follow-up question from the episode on Stanley tumblers that came out a few weeks ago. And it's especially relevant to those of you who have piles of stickers laying around who can't commit to sticking on anything. You can subscribe and get access to all of the Ask Anne Anything segments if you go to culturestudypod.substack.com. Thank you so much for listening to the Culture Study Podcast. Be sure to subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. We have so many great episodes in the works, and I promise you don't want to miss any of them. If you want to suggest a topic, ask a question about the culture that surrounds you, or submit a question for our subscriber-only advice time segment, check the show notes for a link to our Substack. If you want to support the show and get bonus content, head to culturestudypod.substack.com. It's $5 a month or $50 a year, and you'll get ad-free episodes, an exclusive advice time segment, weekly discussion threads for each episode, and a link to a special Google form so that your questions go to the front of the line. The Culture Study Podcast is produced by me, Anne Helen Peterson, and Melody Rowell. Our music is by Poddington Bear. You can find me on Instagram at Anne Helen Peterson, Melody at Melodious47, and the show at Culture Study Pod. Thank you so much for your support.